And thank you so much.
Thank you.
Now it is our last talk before we go into the panel discussion. Our last presenter is Brenna with Florida International University, and the title of her talk is Understanding Local Stakeholder Perspectives and Attitude of Prescribed Burning for Improved Support of Urban Pine Rockland Restoration in Miami-Dade County.
Hey y'all, are you able to hear me, see me?
Yep, everything's great.
All right, let me open this up. Are you seeing my presenter view or my actual presentation?
I see your presenter view with notes.
Great, let me switch that.
If you click on display settings, you should change it.
Excellent, thank you, Vanessa.
No problem.
All right, well, thank you very much to everyone who stuck around. I know that's been a long day and maybe you're a little burnt out by now, so I appreciate everyone's presence. I am a doctoral student at FIU in the Department of Earth and Environment under Dr. Elizabeth Anderson. I'm also a Deering Fellow, so it's really an honor to be here to be able to share my work with you all today. So I'm just going to jump in. Today I'm talking a little bit about my work towards understanding local stakeholder perceptions of prescribed burning in order to improve and bolster support for urban pine rockland restoration here in Miami-Dade. And before I begin, I usually like to do this before each presentation and do a brief acknowledgement of the first peoples who inhabited the land on which we stand now. I'm currently calling in from Miami Beach, which is historically Tequesta land. And as Sarah mentioned, the Deering Estate is an important archaeological site for the Tequesta culture, which tragically was largely displaced through enslavement, forced assimilation, and genocide by European settlers. And I'd also like to acknowledge the Miccosukee Native American Indians who later inhabited this land and to this day protect and remember important traditional ecological knowledge about our region. So to get started, I'd like to ask you all to just keep a question in mind as I go throughout my presentation. And this question is, what does fire mean to you? And when I say fire, you can interpret that as you will. It might mean wildfire or prescribed fire, or whatever connotations come up for you. And for me, just to give a little context and insight into what inspires me in my own work, I was born and raised here in Florida. Always enjoyed the outdoors, the Everglades, nature in general. And I remember really clearly the first time I saw a forest fire here in South Florida. I was really young and we were flying in from somewhere. And I remember seeing these really bright blazes in the night as we flew over Miami over the Everglades. And as an adult now and a conservation biologist, I understand that what I was probably seeing was a prescribed burn. But at the time, I remember feeling really worried and scared. Worried for these ecosystems I really cared about, and I would think about like how the animals are adapting to this fire. And I say this because I think that we as ecologists, conservationists, whatever your role is in this space that we're in right now, I think it's really important that we acknowledge that the knowledge and insights that we possess about fire in natural systems shouldn't be taken for granted. It's really easy to assume that the understandings we have about fire being beneficial in some ecosystems, we might think it's obvious, but I just invite you all to consider that when we talk about prescribed burning in natural areas, these practices can be perceived as far from beneficial by laymen who are not familiar with the benefits that these types of prescribed burnings or fire in general can provide to certain ecosystems. And I think it's important for us to bear this in mind, this dissonance, when we talk about pine rockland restoration here in South Florida. Much of our remaining pine rockland stands occur in relatively small parcels within the urban matrix of Miami-Dade County. And since these pine rockland systems are fire dependent ecosystems, we really need to gain a better understanding of the urban residents' attitudes towards burning practices to ensure that we're conducting culturally informed and biologically sound restoration. And for these restoration efforts to be socially accepted, they need to align with social goals and values. So just to give you guys a little bit of context about previous work that's been done in this realm of attitudes, perceptions around fire, back in 2002, the Illinois Department of Natural Resources conducted a massive survey of the residents to gain a better understanding of these types of perceptions. And they found that the most significant predictor of opposition or support for prescribed burning practices was the residents' level of knowledge about such practices and their experiences with burning. And more recently, Jason Gordon of the University of Georgia published this study last year in 2020 about the public attitudes in the Gulf Coast towards prescribed burn. And while this study didn't measure ecological knowledge, they did find that sociodemographic factors were important determinants of support. And they also looked at something we'll call place attachment and found that there was a really strong correlation between place attachment and positive attitudes towards prescribed burning. And so why should we ask these questions here in South Florida? I don't think it's important for me to impress the importance of Pine Rockland conservation to this audience. I think it's likely that most of y'all are familiar with the kind of dire figures that come along with Pine Rockland restoration, less than 1% extent still remaining. There's this urgent need to preserve these incredibly biodiverse habitats that are being encroached on by development and degradation. But I think we need to consider how we can go about achieving this, given all the additional barriers that an urban setting presents to restoration efforts. And if we accept those two previous findings that I described back in 2002 and 2020, if we accept that place attachment, ecological knowledge, and sociodemographics are important variables for support, then what does that mean in a majority minority city where over 50% of the population is foreign born? We're incredibly heterogeneous and diverse, and it's hard to make predictions about what people's perceptions will be in a space like this. So that kind of inspired these two research questions that I am delving into with one chapter of my dissertation. We're looking at what the local resident perceptions and attitudes towards prescribed fire are. And additionally, what variables could we potentially use as predictors for these attitudes? And so that first question is not so much something that will be answered through traditional a priori hypothesis testing, and it will likely be more based on observation of the data. But part of me thinks that potentially this might be predicted by resident proximity to spaces that require frequent burning, or whether or not people have had experience with burning in their towns, or have driven by a burn and been inquisitive about what the purpose of such practices were. But that second variable, if we like I said, believe in those two prior studies that I mentioned, then we likely see a higher correlation or close correlation between high place attachment and ecological knowledge and the people's levels of support. And I'm particularly interested in looking at sociodemographic information as a potential predictor, but I'm not sure which way that'll go. So as far as methods, we've constructed an online survey that will construct a summative scale of three what we'll call independent variables here: ecological knowledge, perceptions of prescribed fire, and place attachment. We'll also be gathering data about individual statuses, sociodemographic variables, and land tenure is potentially another predictor, whether or not someone has been in the same place for long enough to experience burning. And this also ties a little bit into place attachment. People tend to be more to create these types of relationships with places when they're in one spot for a long time. So I think land tenure will potentially be a good predictor. And all this will be, we'll use a logistical regression to compare these types of predictors with would potentially be our dependent variable, Pine Rockland, or support for Pine Rockland restoration and burning. And we're hoping to distribute this instrument through the Fairchild and Deering memberships. I think we'll get a lot of heterogeneity in metrics based on just the vast amount of people that have become members of these types of places. So, and this survey again is adapted from several different surveys instruments that have been used to look at these types of questions. And ideally, the outcomes, we're hoping that the results from this survey analysis will be used to generate some recommendations for restoration strategies that can be culturally informed and consider stakeholder perceptions. I really love this quote from Eric Higgs. This is a book he wrote back in 2003 that focused on human dimensions of ecological restoration. And social engagement is a vital part of restoration, not merely an afterthought. Restoration must be conceived in a way that makes the connections between culture and ecology, people, and place prominent. So I kind of flew through that much faster than when I practiced, but that gives me some time to say thank you to the people that have supported me, FIU, my team at the Tropical Rivers Lab, my advisor, the Deering Estate Foundation, which I'm incredibly grateful to be a part of your team, as well as the Fairchild Tropical Botanical Garden, to which I'm also a graduate fellow. I'm happy to answer any questions, and if anyone would like to contact me or potentially collaborate, feel free to email me or follow me on Twitter, and we can send cool stuff to each other. So thank you for your time, and I'm open for questions.
Thank you so much, Brenna. We have a few minutes for questions. If anyone would like to ask Brenna, please unmute yourself.
Lowell, I think I see Lowell raised his hand.
Yes. Hi, Brenna. Great talk.
Hey.
So as far as your, because Miami, like you said, Miami is a very heterogeneous community, and I think in the greater context of South Florida, you also have communities in the Everglades where where we also have Pine Rocklands and Hardwick hammocks, and I think particularly in terms of indigenous tribes there. So my question is, within this heterogeneous community of Miami, do you have like a particular community you're trying to target, or are you trying to cast a wide net and try to the best of your ability to get as much diversity of stakeholder opinions, and especially when it comes towards groups that are often left out of conservation efforts?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you, Lowell. So for anyone who's ever done a survey-based study, you'll know that it is a big challenge is getting a good response rate. And if you cast too kind of narrow of a net, then you run into problems of really low sample sizes. So my strategy is to kind of send it out as much as possible. I'm not targeting a particular demographic. Initially what I really wanted to do was, well, I'll go even further back. What I would like to have done, but prior to COVID restrictions and stuff, would have been to do some stakeholder town hall meetings and focus groups. But I kind of narrowed my scope a little bit methods wise, just in light of COVID, unfortunately. And so my second thought after COVID happened was to try to target residents that are within a mile radius of Deering Estate or other places in Miami Dade that are subject to burning. And Deering alone, within a mile radius of your Pine Rocklands, there's over 1,000 residences. So it's quite costly to send out mail surveys in that way and to be really targeted in that way. So to answer your question, I'm casting a little bit more of a wide net. And ideally, if, I'm trying to be very careful about the things that I commit to, because if, as a grad student, we are on a pretty strict timeline, and I don't want to be restricted too much because of COVID. But ideally, I would like to do some stakeholder interviews and some more targeted methods, but that remains to be seen how feasible it is in the future.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thanks, Lola.
Thank you, Lowell, for your question. It would be helpful if I unmuted myself and not just talking to myself in my office. Thank you so much, Brenna, for your talk. Does anyone else have a question? If not, we will move on to the panel session.
Thanks, Dr. Trujillo. It's good to see you.
Good to see you too. Okay, let me share my screen.